This week with the American Historical Imprints database, I decided to stay focused on the topic I use for the JSTOR database, and that is missionary activities amongst the Cherokee Indians before removal in North Georgia. Now, I wanted to focus on the Moravian missionaries because they did quite a bit of work amongst the Cherokee. But just like with the JSTOR database and the journal articles, I find plenty of articles on the Cherokee Indians and plenty of primary sources on the Cherokee Indians, and some on the Moravian missionaries or Moravian church, but very few. I had difficulty finding articles that brought those two topics together. So what I found myself doing was looking for primary sources that dealt with the general topic or were around the same time period. That kind of gives a feel for the attitudes of both the European settlers and the conflicts that were going on involving the Cherokee. Now, one challenge with this database is that by its very nature, it's mostly English documents about early American history, colonial history. The sources are going to be, just by their very nature, kind of one sided from the European or colonist perspective. And you kind of have to tease out the positions of the Cherokee. So the first article I used or came across, the first primary source, was from 1740 and entitled A Continuation of Reverend Mr. Whitfield's Journey from a few days after his arrival in Georgia to his second return thither from Pennsylvania. This involves the famous preacher George Whitfield, in his swing through the colony of Georgia at this time. Now, this is 1740, so it's roughly 90 years before my time period. But what it does is give you an interesting perspective on the religious climate in Georgia and what that's going to kind of turn into within the next 9 decades. And Whitfield was an interesting character. When he went to these different congregations, he was a very famous preacher, revival preacher. And depending on the congregation, some welcomed him with open arms, whereas other pastors kind of saw him as showing up, getting the parishioners riled up, and then he would move on to the next town and leave them having to deal with the new kindled religiosity and fervor amongst the parishioners. So this was an interesting article that it gave insight in kind of the religious scene in Georgia at the time and some of the different congregations. My next article is from 1762, and this one involves the Cherokee Indians. It's entitled Some Observations on the Two Campaigns Against the Cherokee Indians in 1760 and 61. Um, and it deals with conflicts in North Georgia with the Cherokee Indians as settlers begin to come across the Appalachian Mountains in violation of a treaty the British had signed with the Cherokee. Um, and this increases conflict with them. Now, here again, this is before my time period, but this is a continuation. What happens to the Cherokee in the 1830s is a continuation of what starts during this time period, where you have settlers slowly encroaching on their land and pushing them off of it and getting into conflict with them. This will come to a head once gold is discovered in North Georgia, and this will kind of be the final straw for Cherokees living in their native lands in the colony and then state of Georgia. So that gives an interesting perspective on the position of the Cherokees and kind of a preview of what's to come as far as the period of my research is concerned. Now, for my third article, this one, interesting enough, was written anonymously. It's from 1776, so the year of the Revolution, and it's entitled An Affectionate Address to the Inhabitants of the British Colonies in America by a Lover and Friend of Mankind. And this one was basically a transcript of a sermon that was delivered in Philadelphia at the time, or it was published in Philadelphia. I believe it was delivered in the New England colonies. But what makes this article interesting, or this sermon, this reprinted sermon interesting, is that it goes into the whole idea of manifest destiny and how this was something that was intended by God, and it was a mission by God, and how it is the duty of the Christian missionaries to reach out to the indigenous people and bring them to the faith, the Christian faith. So here again, before my time period, but it reflects that attitude that is going to continue amongst the Moravian missionaries and their activities amongst the Cherokees in the early 19th century.